Und er hat bereits eine Arbeit, ein Buch veröffentlicht zur politischen Ökonomie der Besatzung in Israel und ist deswegen eben halt genau der richtige Experte für dieses Thema.
So, good evening. The topic of today's talk is does Israel profit from the occupation? But I think it's very important to acknowledge that today is the International Day of Human Rights. And I don't know if people here read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Maybe some of you know this text, which has been published in many languages by the United Nations. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I recommend reading this text, is a document that was signed by most countries in the world, including Israel. And I read it, and I didn't find in this document any part that says that people have a right not to be occupied. Living under occupation is not, living free from military occupation is not listed in this document as one of the basic universal human rights. And I think that's interesting for us to consider that, in fact, military occupation is not illegal under international law, even though it can contain many illegal acts. The idea, but nevertheless, when you read this document, you will find that almost each one of these basic human rights that are listed in this document, there are quite a few of them, it's 8 pages, each one of them is violated by the Israeli occupation in Palestine. The rights for freedom of movement, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of organization, the right for safety, the right to access adequate housing, to access adequate nourishment, food, are all threatened by the Israeli military occupation. And I think that if we read that and we see that all these rights are being violated, we might get the idea that the Israeli authorities are very cruel, that they are evil in their way of treating the Palestinians, and I think that is a wrong way to look at this. I think that we cannot simply attribute these violations of human rights to a characteristic of the Israeli public or the Israeli government. We have to understand why does the government pursue these policies? Why does the Israeli army violate all of these human rights, which are in a document that was signed by the Israeli government? And this really brings us to the question, does Israel profit from the occupation? Do they do it because they profit from it somehow? But I think we really have to look at this question and to break it apart a little bit, because I think it's probably this is the last time I will ever give a lecture on this topic. I've given this lecture many times in the past, but the components of the question, does Israel profit from the occupation, are starting to lose their meaning. The word occupation becomes very vague. We have to be clear, what occupation are we talking about? The State of Israel exists since 1948 for 67 years, and during those 67 years it has occupied many parts, many pieces of land. Some of them it withdrew from, but most of them it did not withdraw from. In Syria, in Lebanon, in Egypt, and of course in Palestine. I will speak just about the occupation in Palestine today. That will be the focus. So we're just focusing on the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But it's this area that is interesting because this is the area where there is a large civilian population living under military occupation. The Syrian Golan Heights, which is at the part of Syria that Israel still occupies, has been ethnically cleansed of its population. Only a very small number of people were allowed to remain. So there is no relation between a military government and an occupied population like we have in Palestine. So this is just to clarify what kind of occupation we're talking about. The problem is that if we ask the question, does Israel profit from occupation, we have to imagine a reality that what would be without an occupation. Could we imagine an Israel without the West Bank and Gaza? And this is something that seems very strange to someone looking from the outside. Because I told you Israel exists as a state for 67 years. 48 years it had the West Bank and the Gaza Strip occupied. 19 years, so just a third of its history, it existed without this territory. So if we want to ask what would be Israel without occupation, we have to take the year 1967, it was 48 years ago, and imagine what would Israel be like if it stayed like that. Or maybe we extrapolate. We can make a sort of thought experiment, what in history is called a counterfactual history, and try to imagine how history could have been if, for example, after the war of 1967, the Israeli government would decide to go back to the borders before the war. And of course, from a scientific point of view, this is very shaky grounds. I would not recommend it. And I think if we look at it from a point of view of, from an economic point of view, we can find something very interesting. We find that the growth rate of the Israeli economy, the GDP, gross domestic product, of the Israeli economy in the first 19 years was extremely high. If that growth rate would have been maintained after 1967, then Israel would today be a very rich country, much richer than Germany, for example, much richer than Germany. But I think it is very strange to assume that this could really happen. I think because there are other examples in the world where countries had very high growth rates for a certain period of time, for example, the Soviet Union, and the growth rate did not sustain itself. So instead, we see a lot of Israeli scholars and a lot of international scholars asking the question, does Israel profit from the occupation? How can we imagine Israel without an occupation? And they still ask the question. It's still important for them to bring this question up. And in order to address it, what they do is they don't try to build a model of let's extend the Israel of 1967 to today, which is not practical, but instead they try to say, let's look at what the occupation does to Israeli society through items, through a list of specific things, like what does the government spend money on? And this is what I will show right now. Of course, the question, does Israel profit from the occupation, suffers from another problem, because it has the word Israel in it, where we imagine Israel to be one unit. And I think it will not surprise you to hear that there are people who profit from the occupation and there are people who lose from the occupation. So the question of whether Israel is profiting or not is a very strange question. We have to ask who are the people who are profiting and who are the people who are losing, and how can these people who are in a position to profit or who are in a position where they lose affect the decision whether to continue the occupation or not. I don't know if you saw the flyer that we distributed for today. It had this picture on it, which I think is a little provocative, with half of it looking like an orange and the other half looks like a grenade. This is a picture that was made by a Palestinian artist in order to promote the boycott movement against Israel, but I think it's a very useful picture for us today, because actually the two sides of this picture, the orange and the grenade, are two sides of what kind of profit Israel generates from the occupation. because between 1948 and 1967, there was another occupation, right? Not the occupation that I will talk about today so much. It was in not in the West Bank and Gaza, but in what in the internationally recognized border of Israel. And there, more than 700 Palestinian villages were destroyed. And on the land of these villages, one of the main crops was oranges. And oranges were a very important export for the young state of Israel. And two Israeli economists commented that after the war of 1967 and after the occupation of the Palestinian territory, the Israeli economy transformed. And instead of exporting oranges, it started to exporting weapons. And the profit came not from use of the land, which is how you produce oranges, but use of the people as test subjects for weapons, like grenades, but other weapons. Broadly speaking, if we want to talk about the question, does Israel profit from the occupation or not, we have to talk a little bit how this distributes historically, because different periods of time has a different form of occupation and a different relation between occupied and occupier. The first decade of the occupation is a decade in which the profits for the Israeli economy were very clear. The first decade brought very high growth, and it also brought a lot of donations, international donations, from Jewish communities especially, to the state of Israel, because the victory in the war was seen as a sign that Israel is a strong state that is going to sustain itself for many years, so it's a good reason to donate to this state. But it also created a lot of other kinds of sources of profit. I will talk about them in the next slide. But interestingly, the first decade was also profitable for Palestinians, because the Palestinian population that came under Israeli occupation, before that they lived under Jordanian or Egyptian rule, and suddenly they become subject to the military government. And the military government first decision was not to allow Palestinians to enter into Israel, and not to allow Palestinians to work inside Israel, to seek work in Israel. And also the military government issued a new currency, that the Palestinians will not be able to get Israeli currency, so they will have a special currency for the occupied territory. This decision of the military government lasted for just a few weeks before it collapsed, because Israeli business people wanted Palestinian workers, and they wanted to trade directly with Palestinians and to pay with Israeli currency, and immediately the Palestinian territories were absorbed into the Israeli economy. And this absorption meant that Palestinians could work in Israel, and even though they worked mainly in jobs were very low-paying jobs inside Israel, like construction, agriculture, and in the service industry, but the average wage, the average income of Palestinians working in Israel was 8 times higher than the average wage that existed beforehand in the West Bank and in Gaza. So Palestinians, especially young Palestinians, suddenly were making more money than their parents if they could work in construction inside Israel, and that was a very big change also in the Palestinian society and the social structure of the family, for example. But interestingly, the way that the money comes into the Palestinian population in that time is very strongly controlled by Israel. That means that Palestinians who were making all that money, they actually did not know that the occupation is going to continue for so long. Most Israelis also did not know in 1967 that the occupation is going to last for 5 decades. It was seen as some temporary bargaining chip in order to negotiate for a peace treaty. And it was just a matter of time until Israel would withdraw, or so they thought. In fact, the first commander of the occupied territory said We should not build any hospitals. We should not pave any roads. Why should we give presents to our enemies? We're going to give this land back. So let's just keep it like it is and not spend any money on it because it's only temporary. But the Israeli government was still concerned that the Palestinians will use the money that they're making in order to make investments in sectors of the economy that could compete with the Israeli economy. For example, Palestinians in Nablus had an industry for making shoes, and they could make shoes much more cheaply than the Israeli shoe manufacturers. So the Israeli government issued a set of regulations that made it impossible for the shoemakers in Nablus. Nablus is a city in the West Bank, for those of you who don't know. Impossible for them to import machines to work leather. Illegal for them to import leather. Impossible for them to take their product through the checkpoints or into Israel. Impossible for them to get reliable electricity connection. In the end, the factory closed down. They could not build a factory under these conditions. And this is one example out of thousands of examples like this. So Palestinians had two things they could do with the money that they made if they wanted to invest it for the day after the occupation. They could invest in education and they could invest in housing. Education is very important. Until today, Palestinians are the most educated people in the Arab world. And they built more than 20 institutions of higher learning in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which was all done with local money because the Israeli government did not invest in higher education in Palestine. But they also built houses because they had the money. But the problem with housing is that it's not really a good investment if everyone is building houses. It increases your standard of living if you can have more rooms, that's nice, but you can't expect to rent your apartment or sell it for a profit if everyone is building a new house. So this is the first decade of occupation. Coming to the second decade of occupation, things are starting to change. One of the main things that changes is oil prices are going down. And then we discover something very interesting. We discover that a large part of the Palestinian population, the educated Palestinians, who cannot get a job inside Israel because Israel does not need educated Palestinians. They're not going to give jobs to Palestinian doctors or engineers or teachers. They went and worked in the Gulf states. So Saudi Arabia, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Qatar, and so on. In the Gulf states, their education was a big advantage, and they could work in their jobs for which they were educated, and they could send their money back to their family in Palestine. So they were guest workers. They did not become citizens of these countries, and they sent their money back to their families. But if you think about it a little bit, you realize that there's a problem because these countries did not have diplomatic relations with Israel. Israel controlled the Palestinian territory, but Israel had no diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia or Qatar or Kuwait. But by allowing Palestinian workers to go and work and send their money back, effectively Israel was creating economic relations with these countries, and effectively Israel was importing foreign currency from these countries, and that was a very important advantage for the Israeli economy. Until the oil prices started to go down in the 1980s, and a lot of Palestinians started losing their jobs and had to go home. At the same time, Israel also had an economic crisis, a very deep economic crisis, which included hyperinflation between 100 and 400% inflation every year between the years 1981 and 1985. And during this crisis, Israeli workers, they had very strong unions. They had some labor rights, which today don't exist anymore, but they used to exist in Israel until the middle of the 80s. And they could get their wages adjusted for inflation every month. Palestinians did not have that. Palestinians were working as daily workers without any rights, without any contract, without any unions. So when there's a hyperinflation of 100% to 400%, their wages is being destroyed. The wage is being destroyed, right? Because they would get the same amount of money, but they cannot buy anything with it anymore, or they buy less and less. And at the same time, when there is an economic crisis in Israel, a lot of them just lose their jobs. Now, you have this generation of Palestinians coming back from the Gulf states. You have a generation of Palestinians who have lost their jobs in Israel. You have a new generation of Palestinians who have saved their money to get education, and they have new degrees from the university, but they have no way to work with this degree. And the only thing that they can do is to go back to their lands, to go back to agriculture, and to work on their family lands and try to make money from agriculture. The problem is, there is an Ottoman law, which the Israeli military government decided to enforce in the occupied territory. The Ottoman law says, it was written by the Sultan many years before there was Israel, or even before the British mandate, which said that if somebody does not use their land for 3 years, they will lose access to the land. The land can be confiscated by the Sultan. So the Israeli military government said, well, we are the Sultan. And since these people have lost access to their land, maybe because they moved to work in the Gulf states, maybe because they work in Israel, maybe because there is a colony that was built on their land, so they cannot reach it anymore. Or maybe there is a special road that prevents them access. So now they cannot get their land back. Now the land has been confiscated. And when you have a generation of Palestinians who reach that moment where they realize they lost their land, their education is useless, they cannot find employment, this is when the first Intifada begins in 1987. And it's this first Intifada that changes the relations between Israel and the occupied population, 20 years after the occupation. The first Intifada had more reasons, not just economic reasons. I'm giving you the economic reasons. I'm an economist. I like to look at the world through these eyes, but I think it's very important to acknowledge that people who do not risk their lives and rebel against an occupation just because of money. They do it because they are fighting for their freedom, they are fighting for their dignity, and because they realize that if they don't do it, the occupation is not going to end. Israel is not going to withdraw from the territory in exchange for peace treaty like they thought for many years. The first Intifada changed the way that Israel was also managing this territory. That brings us to the third decade. Because in the third decade, the Israeli government had to increase the number of soldiers stationed in the West Bank and in Gaza by a factor of 10. Increase the number of soldiers by a factor of 10. These soldiers also had to be equipped with new equipment that they did not need before. Armored vehicles, armored vests, security cameras. These things they didn't really need until the first Intifada, because the Palestinians did not really rebel in large numbers, and the Israeli soldiers felt safe. But as soon as Palestinians are starting to rebel in large numbers, the Israeli army started to need more and more mechanisms to repress the rebel. Repression costs money, a lot of money. At that point, the Israeli government is starting to look for alternatives. And for the first time in many years, the Labour Party wins the elections in Israel. The Labour Party is considered to be more left in Israel, but I think we have to be careful about making comparisons of left and right between Israel and other countries. And the Prime Minister, Yitzhak Rabin, has an idea that he does not want to give back the land that Israel occupied, but he wants to get rid of the population somehow. The idea, which he called, and many others called after him, separation. Separation between the populations. And in order to do that, Rabin tells his cabinet, we cannot use the Israeli army anymore as police, because Palestinian children were throwing stones and hanging Palestinian flags, demonstrators on the street. This is not what the Israeli army should be training for. The Israeli army needs to train for war. We need somebody to create order for us. Somebody who will do it without the supervision of human rights organizations, and will do it without the intervention of the Israeli Supreme Court. And then he convinced the Israeli cabinet to support the creation of the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority will be this body. Somebody to act as a subcontractor for the Israeli military to keep that area under control. Yasser Arafat, who was the chairman of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, and the first head of the Palestinian Authority, he probably had other ideas. I don't think that he had the same opinions as Rabin about what is the role of the Palestinian Authority. He didn't want to do Israel's dirty work for Israel. He wanted to see the Palestinian Authority as a first step towards independence. Unfortunately, this is a story that is now 22 years old. And 22 years later, the Palestinian Authority did not become independent. They did not manage to end the occupation. So apparently, in this sort of disagreement, Rabin was more correct than Arafat. The Oslo negotiations that started the creation of the Palestinian Authority created the impression the occupation is going to end soon, so without occupation, Israel is going to become a normal country and can be accepted into the international community. This was something that inside Israel had a very strong impact. And in fact, for the first time, McDonald's opened a branch in Israel, which was a sort of symbol that now Israel is going to become a country in peace, because McDonald's, so they claim, only open branches in countries where there is peace. I think I don't have to tell you that this is not true, but it was a sort of symbol. And the Oslo negotiations opened a lot of markets for Israel. And they brought in a lot of international investments into Israel. And at the same time that investments are starting to pour into Israel, there is also international aid coming into to help the Palestinians build their own state. But I will talk about this aid soon. And finally, we have the fourth decade, which is actually a decade and a half, because it's already 15 years, more or less, which starts when the Palestinians are realize that the Palestinian Authority is not really leading to an independent state. The Oslo negotiations fail. The Israeli government is not willing to relinquish territory. It's only willing to relinquish responsibilities to the Palestinian Authority. The economic situation worsens for the Palestinians, but doesn't seem to worsen for Israel, and then Palestinians go again in another wave of rebellion, the Second Intifada. And again, I have to say, the Second Intifada had other reasons, not just economic reasons, but the economic reasons are there because we really see that all of this aid, all of this international effort to help the Palestinian economy does not really work. Palestinian poverty is increasing, unemployment is increasing, and Palestinians realize that, and at the same time, Israel, from the beginning of the Oslo negotiations, implements a closure policy. Closure means Palestinians, just as a sort of collective punishment, are not allowed to go into Israel. And that means that they lose their jobs. So if we're talking about this fourth decade, it's still very hotly contested. Where are the profits? Where are the losses? Is it really profitable to Israel or not? This is a very fierce argument that we see in academia. And I think there is no question, however, that for the Palestinians, the current situation is very damaging and very unhelpful. Separation continues with the wall, with the siege on Gaza, and also with laws and regulations to try to keep the population from mixing. And there's this concept of warehousing, which maybe I'll have time to go back to it later, which is a kind of new technology of treating people, unwanted people, as a problem that needs to be contained, and Israel is developing technologies of human containment and selling these technologies. Okay, so now let's look at it a bit more closely. First of all, Israel is not the first country in the world that conquers another territory and occupies. I hope that is well known. There is a very long history of colonization. Israel is one of the last countries in the world that colonizes another territory. And the idea that we can use colonial models or colonial thinking models to understand how exactly the occupation works is an idea that started from the very beginning, from 1967. Especially Marxist economists, Palestinian economists have said, we have here a classic case of colonial exploitation of an occupied land. At the same time, the answer of Israeli economists in these first years of occupation, they didn't say, look, actually we are really suffering from this occupation, we want to end it and we want to have peace. They said, no, it's true that Israel is profiting from this occupation, but the Palestinians are also profiting, so they should be grateful. And interestingly, this kind of answer, the occupied should be grateful for the occupier, is exactly the kind of economic reasoning that we heard from the colonial powers of the past, from the British Empire, the French Empire. That's how they justify the colonization. Say, well, the Indians should be grateful for the railroads and agriculture that we are developing in India. Specifically, the way that this exploitation works is in these 5 main areas. The raw materials, which means construction materials and water especially. These are the main raw materials that are exploited from Palestinian territory by Israel, until today, of course. Land confiscation. Land confiscation is very clear because the area that Israel controls most tightly and basically confiscated completely from Palestinians is called Area C, which is 65% of the total West Bank. And that is also the area with most of the agricultural land, water resources, and also strategic locations. The third point is the cheap Palestinian labor. That's something I already talked about, how Palestinians could work inside Israel for very low wages. You know that all Palestinians working inside Israel were required to pay union fees to the Histadrut. The Histadrut is the Federation of Labor Unions in Israel. Back in these days, it was a very strong organization. Today it's rather weak. But it was an organization that supported the labor unions of all Israeli workers. Palestinians had to pay to become members of the Histadrut if they wanted to work in Israel, but they did not receive the benefits. They were not protected by the Histadrut. They were not protected by the Israeli labor laws. So they only paid but got nothing in return, and that's also a form of exploitation. The remittances from the Gulf states I already described. Palestinians working in the Gulf states, sending their money back to their families, but what do their families do with this money? They spend it in the Israeli economy, they buy Israeli products, right? So it is a way to get foreign currency. And 5, very important, is the captive market. If you go today to a city in the West Bank, even in Gaza, to a supermarket, to a grocery store, you will see on the shelves products in Hebrew. You will see Israeli products everywhere. Because the Israeli companies have access to the Palestinian market. They can send their trucks through the checkpoint without a problem. They pay no taxes. They have no problem reaching any part of the Palestinian market. Palestinian companies, of course, cannot reach the Israeli market. And if Palestinians say, well, we don't want the Israeli products, we want to import from China, from Europe, we want to import something else, well, they don't have a seaport. They don't have an airport. So they need to work with a company, an importing company, which is an Israeli importing company. The Israeli company will import it for them, take their profit, and then give them the products at a higher price. So this is what I mean by a captive market.
And what's the example?
for a captive market. I actually don't know the German word. Gefangenenmarkt. Yeah. Yeah. In the last 20 years, we have another form of exploitation, which is the aid. How Palestinians receive international aid from the world. Germany is actually one of the donors. The European Union as a whole is the biggest donor. And the aid is supposed to create development for Palestinians. But you remember what I said before about these regulations, that Palestinians cannot import machinery or cannot import raw materials. These regulations were not changed. And the aid that is being distributed to Palestinians does not allow them to build factories, actually, because if they try, the Israeli authorities prevent them from bringing in materials and machines, and even in some cases, bomb the factories or bomb the infrastructure. So with this understanding, the international donors, especially the European Union, decided they're going to change the way that they give donations to the Palestinians, because nobody likes to build a factory and see it bombed. And they decided, in fact, to give Palestinians only humanitarian aid. Almost only. Today the development aid is very small, but humanitarian aid is the vast majority. Humanitarian aid means food, medicine, tents for people who lost their homes, emergency aid, like we see in areas hurt by natural catastrophes, like in Nepal. But of course, Palestine is not hit by a natural catastrophe, it's hit by a man-made catastrophe. And this aid helps people survive. It's very important because in the Second Intifada, for example, the Israeli army uprooted 300,000 trees, fruit trees, mainly olive trees, which people need to eat. If 300,000 trees are destroyed, then what are people going to eat? Well, they're going to eat food that is sent to them by the international community. But actually, this is exactly what the Israeli government wanted. Because this emergency aid is actually distributed through Israeli channels. According to the Paris Accords, the Paris Accord is the economic attachment to the Oslo Accord. There is a customs envelope that includes all of Palestine, so Israel and the West Bank and Gaza. And that means that products from outside they have to pay customs to Israel. Israel can then take some of that customs and give it to the Palestinian Authority, but they sometimes forget. But that means that for the donors, it's always cheaper to buy Israeli products, because then they don't have to pay any customs. And so the biggest suppliers of food and medicine to Palestinians are Israeli companies. And these Israeli companies pay taxes to the Israeli government, and so the donors actually have turned the occupation into a kind of export for Israel. Israel is providing services and goods, gets money in foreign currency, in euros, and this is something that improves the Israeli balance of payments and very much. But I've spoken so much about exploitation, I've spoken so much about profits from the occupation, we also have to talk about the other side, the cost of occupation, right? And I'll start with the colonies. In 1967, when one day after the war, there were 0 colonies in the West Bank and Gaza. There were no Israeli citizens living in that territory. Now there are more than 600,000. So over 48 years, the Israeli government colonized 600,000 people on Palestinian land. This is a violation of the 4th Geneva Convention. Israel is actually a signatory to the 4th Geneva Convention, which says that an occupying power is not allowed to transfer its own population to an occupied territory. The Israeli government responds to this and says, we did not transfer our population, they decided to go. But why did they decide to go? Mainly, the main reason, not the only one, but the main reason, is the subsidies that they received from the Israeli government. The Israeli government spends on every colonist 235% compared to what it spends on an average Israeli citizen. More than twice. That means more schools, more health services. The colonists pay fewer taxes and receive a lot of other benefits. And that, of course, encourages people to move to the colonies, but it also costs a lot of money to the Israeli government. I'll give you an overview in a minute. But it's not just about these subsidies that cost a lot of money to the Israeli government, it's also about how the occupation affects the Israeli economy. Because, I don't know if you noticed, I mentioned the Histadrut, and I said the Histadrut used to be a very strong organization that protected worker rights. Today it's very weak. I said there used to be very strong labor laws in Israel that protected people from inflation. And now these laws have been dismantled. Why did that happen? So it didn't happen only in Israel. There are many countries in the world that had this sort of neoliberal transformation. Most countries in the world, I should say. Most countries in the world have undergone this kind of transformation. But in Israel it was faster than most other countries. In fact, in 1965, so 2 years before the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, there was an international comparison of the level of equality and inequality in different countries of the world. And this survey found that Israel was ranked between Finland and the Netherlands, one of the most equal economies in the world. Although they already had 20% of the population were Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, who were discriminated. But in terms of wage differences, the wage differences were not as extreme as they are today. And in fact, the difference between the income or the wage of Palestinian workers in the Palestinian cities inside Israel was about 25% of the wage of Jewish workers. So that means Jews were making 4 times more money. But if you compare it to the inequality in other countries in the world, the inequality was even higher. Today, actually, there are a lot of articles in the Israeli newspaper talking about the new poverty report that came out in Israel yesterday. And it shows that Israel is the most unequal economy in the OECD, the Organization of Developed Economies. And in fact, in all the developed world, there's only one country which is more unequal than Israel, that is the United States. And so Israel moved from being one of the most equal to one of the most unequal. How does that work? It works, for example, when we look at the effect of the occupation on the Palestinian labor market. Because when Palestinians start to work in construction, for example, and get half as much money as the Israeli workers who used to work in construction, then the Israeli construction market splits. You have people who lose their jobs because they want to be paid minimum wage, and they have the right to be paid minimum wage, but why would the employer pay minimum wage when they can have for that money 2 Palestinians from the West Bank or from Gaza? And then there are some who become the managers. So some of these Israeli workers become managers, and the others become unemployed. So you see how inequality is created. And when you have a whole group of people who have no rights, then soon enough you have this weakens the unions. They cannot go on strike when the employers can just bring in Palestinian workers. The unions become weaker, and that brings more inequality, and that weakens the labor laws, weakens the trade unions, and so on. Okay, so that makes Israel a very unequal state. The inequality is inside Israel, even if we don't look at the Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza. The inequality inside Israel is very ethnic. People who are Palestinian citizens of Israel are at the bottom of the socio-economic ladder. Above them, you have Jews from Arab countries, the Mizrahim. Jews who have an Arabic tradition, and they are seen as inferior and being paid fewer wages, even if they are third generation in Israel. And then on the top you have the Ashkenazi Jews, whose origins are from Europe. And so this creates an inequality that follows ethnic lines. And of course there's also a very high inequality between, which is gender-based, between men and women. Although I have to say that this is one area where Germany is worse than Israel. This I have to acknowledge. In addition to all these social problems caused by occupation, you have, of course, the security costs. The security costs are, in fact, much higher than all of the social subsidies. All of the money that the government gives to the colonists is only a third of the cost of occupation. 2/3 are the cost of the security. Because you have many aspects by which the Israeli government controls the Palestinian territory, and all of these aspects cost money. Prisons where Palestinian prisoners are kept, the wall of separation, which you know is very big and very expensive, all this military vehicles and the security cameras and so on, all these things cost a lot of money. So this is a graph that shows very roughly what are the costs and what are the benefits of the occupation. On the bottom you can see the income from the occupation, which goes in the direction of left, the exploitation. So the exploitation of the Palestinian economy is big. It's almost 75 billion shekels if we look at 2007 prices. These are a bit old prices, but I wanted you to see this graph because this one has all the names on it. Maybe it's too small for you to read, but I'll tell you what are the important ones at least. Then we have income to Israel from the wage additions that Palestinians have to pay, like they pay for social security or for pensions or for health insurance, but they don't get the benefits. So what they pay goes into the Israeli institutions and is a form of exploitation. The Istadrut fees, I mentioned before, where Palestinians have to pay union fees, and then social security that Palestinians have to pay. So these are income. The more we go up, then we can see all the forms of expenses, what the Israeli government pays to maintain the occupation. This is just the government, not individual citizens, just the government. And you see that the government pays some money to give subsidies to colonists in terms of better water services. Water is the first thing that costs money to the Israeli government. So it's a very low number. And then we have subsidies to industry. And then we have the military government of the occupied territory, all of its bureaucracy. Then we have education benefits to the colonists. So every number is higher and higher and higher. Roads, you know that there are special roads which are often called the apartheid roads because only the colonists are allowed to use them and Palestinians are not allowed to drive on these roads. There are a lot of these roads in the West Bank and they cost a lot of money. The wall, of course, but if you really want to go to the very top, this very, very large number that is in itself bigger than all the benefits from the occupation, this is internal security. Because if you go to Israel, you will see security guards everywhere. You will see security guards in supermarkets, in shopping malls. You will see, but this is just the security that you see. Of course, there are also cameras, and on the other side of the cameras there is the security that you don't see. And there is the special training for police, counter-terrorism training that most police forces in the world don't focus on terrorism. Most police forces in the world focus on crime. That's not the case in Israel, where the police is more oriented towards Palestinians and counter-terrorism and repressing Palestinian resistance than they are about law and order for the Israeli society. There is even one branch of the police, which is the border police, which you will not recognize as police. They look like soldiers, they have military equipment, they act like soldiers, but they are paid by the police, because otherwise the defense budget would be even bigger than it is right now. And already the defense budget in Israel, in proportion to GDP to the economy is the highest in the developed world, and according to some estimates, the highest in the world completely. So Germany, for example, spends 1% of its GDP on security, and not on security, on defense. It's 1%, which is a lot. I think that's 1% too much. But Israel spends 7 to 8% every year. So the effect on the economy is dramatic. Okay, let's look at some of these groups and see who is really profiting, who is really losing. What about the consumer companies? Consumer companies profit from captive Palestinian market, right? Because they can reach the supermarkets and grocery stores in the West Bank and in Gaza. And they can also hire Palestinian labor, even today, in the industrial zones in the West Bank or inside Israel to cheaply produce their products. Inside their colonies, these companies can have government benefits if they want to build factories that cause pollution, for example. The pollution laws in the West Bank are not the same as the pollution laws inside Israel. So very polluting companies have an incentive to open their factories in the West Bank, where they will also get other benefits, like cheap land, and cheap security, and cheap electricity. Companies, of course, also take a share of the international aid, right? These consumer companies, they can produce flour, and then when the aid agencies, when the donors want to provide flour for Palestinians, they will buy it from Israeli companies, so they profit. And nevertheless, these companies, very interestingly, when they write their reports, when they make a public discussion about the occupation, they agree that they're losing from the occupation. That's something very interesting because it's not readily apparent. First of all, when the Israeli society becomes poor, when the Israeli society becomes very unequal, and that also affects these companies. They're less able to sell to this company, to the Israeli public. Their prices seem too high to the Israeli public, where the wages are relatively low. And maybe some of you have heard about the social protests in Israel, about the cost of living that Israelis cannot afford to have the same standard of living that they could have 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And they are very concerned that they will have to leave the country, or they will not be able to stay in the middle class, if they are in the middle class. Most recently there was this pudding protest. I saw it was covered also in the German media, so I thought it was rather funny of people who found that a very favorite kind of pudding that people like to buy in the supermarket costs 5 times more in Israel than it does in Germany. And they made the comparison with Germany and said, well, maybe we should all move to Berlin. This caused some kind of stir inside Israel. One of the reasons that the prices are so high, of course, is the cost of security. Because it's not just about the cost of production. Every step of the production process and the store in which the products are sold has to be accompanied by security guards. This makes everything more expensive. And the consumer companies are not too happy about that. In 2011, there was an emergency meeting of the top millionaires of the Israeli economy, the top business owners. And this emergency meeting said, look, we have the Israeli government has to do something to make peace, or to at least have peace negotiations, if not peace, the negotiations of peace. Otherwise, we will be in a situation like South Africa during the time of apartheid, and we will be boycotted by the international community. And they issued a press release with this conclusion, and the government ignored it. And the boycott movement since 2011 has increased very much. So their concern seems to be very valid. And I think it's something that's very interesting also to see that these are very powerful interests inside Israel, very rich people with a lot of power, but they cannot convince the government to end occupation. So who in Israel is still trying so hard to keep the occupation? Let's move to the second group, the colonists. after all of these subsidies I described, I think it should seem clear the colonists are the big profiteers from occupation, or so it would seem. If they get all of these extra schools and clinics and employment possibilities and cheap houses, then they have a really good reason to keep the occupation going. But if we look at how these subsidies are distributed, not all the colonists get the same amount. There are 600,000 colonists. Half of them live in East Jerusalem. East Jerusalem is annexed to Israel by Israeli law. It's not recognized by the international community, but Israel considers East Jerusalem not to be a colony. It considers it to be part of Israel. And these areas of East Jerusalem, which are the biggest colonies, do not receive subsidies, or receive very small subsidies. The biggest subsidies go actually to the smallest colonies, which are deep in Palestinian populated areas like in Hebron. And these are very small colonies which receive a lot of government support to start and build some houses and connect to electricity and water, and they get, of course, a lot of security. But actually, these colonies are very short-lived in that stage. They only stay like that for a few years. The families who start these colonies get all these subsidies, start a small neighborhood, and then their houses are destroyed, and they build bigger houses for more families, which will become what they call the more mainstream colonies, the more moderate colonies, if you want. While the activists, the hardcore colonists who started this colony will move and start a new colony somewhere else because they have a lifelong project. And then they will get more money in that new place. Meanwhile, the people who come into these new, bigger houses, they don't receive the same level of subsidies as the previous generation. So we cannot really say it's just because of the money. Of course, most of the money that goes to these colonies goes for security, not for the standard of living. So that doesn't mean that the colonists are rich. There are some colonists who have been able, through moving into the colonies, to move into the middle class. That does exist, but it cannot explain, really, why there is such a strong support for the occupation in the Israeli society. What about the left, or the so-called left, the Zionist left? This is a group of people who have very consistently spoken out against occupation while supporting it. These are the political parties like the Labour Party, and to a lesser extent also the Meretz Party in Israel, which say we want 2 states for 2 people, but of course they don't want to really talk about the specifics. They speak out against the occupation, but in fact this is a group of people that profits from the occupation in many ways. By speaking about the occupation all the time, they create an illusion, and that's one of the reasons why I'm not going to give this lecture anymore. They create this illusion that the occupation is something new and temporary and some kind of external problem for the Israeli economy or for the Israeli society, which can be removed and resolved somehow. So they still think that the Israel of 1967 is salvageable, that it's somehow possible to go back in time and that would be okay. But of course, it's more of an illusion when they say that without acknowledging that they don't have any ideas about what to do with the 600,000 Israelis who live in the colonies. They say something like, we will have an agreed exchange of land and most of these colonies could stay. But what do you mean by agreed? Because only they agree. The Palestinians have not yet been allowed to express their opinion on the matter. So the agreement is also part of the illusion. There is no discussion about what kind of compensation Israel will have to pay for Palestinians after 48 years of occupation. This is not part of the discourse. It's only that we can get rid of that problem, create separation, and then we will be like Europe. Everything will be fine. But interestingly, it's Europe that supports that this group will continue to support the occupation. When In 2004, Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, who was one of the most violent and aggressive leaders of Israel in history, has announced his plan to disengage from the Gaza Strip. He made it quite clear that he's not talking about liberating the Gaza Strip. He's talking about removing the colonists from the Gaza Strip in order to make it easier for the military to control it. And he also made it quite clear that he considers the West Bank to be part of Israel forever. And while Gaza is not necessary for the Israeli economy, so he's going to create a separation between these two areas. And at that moment, there was a lot of discussion in the international community. And I actually, in my organization in Jerusalem back then, we had some German activists who were volunteering with us, and they were collecting a lot of the articles and press releases and position papers published by European politicians, by German European politicians especially. How do they see this Israeli policy? What is the right response? And I was quite amazed by what I read there, because they were saying, we know that this plan that Israel has for Gaza is not exactly a good plan. We know it's not going to bring peace. We know that it violates international law. But there is a peace camp in Israel. There is this Zionist left. And if we say to Israel, this is not enough, we don't accept that, you have to end occupation, we are going to alienate this, we're going to weaken this Israeli left. So in order to support the Israeli left, we have to support the plan of Ariel Sharon. We have to support this Israeli policy regarding Gaza. So actually, this created a very strange situation. In Israel, there is this so-called peace camp, the Zionist left, a small group of people, electorally, they don't have a lot of power and they don't get a lot of votes in the election, but they are very useful for the Israeli government in order to maintain relations with the rest of the world. Because there is a sort of hostage situation, right? If the international community will put too much pressure on Israel, what will happen to the Zionist left? They will disappear, or they will become weak. So they serve a very important purpose, and that purpose keeps them alive. And today, many of the people in that movement actually also make a living through organizations that are the peace NGOs. Quite a lot of peace NGOs exist. They receive a lot of money, and much of that money, most of it comes from international donors. In fact, one Israeli journalist observed that in 2008, if you remember Castle, the Israeli attack on Gaza at the end of 2008, in which 1,400 Palestinians were killed, there was a big demonstration in Tel Aviv against the war, and 10,000 Israelis came to protest against the war in Gaza. I think 10,000 is a very shameful number, I have to say, when there is a massacre of that scale happening. But 2 years later, there was a law that was promoted by the right-wing government to make it, to close these NGOs, to make it illegal for NGOs which are supported by international donors from operating inside Israel. And again, well, this was seen as a strike against democracy and free speech in Israel. And again, there was a demonstration in Tel Aviv. 50,000 people came to demonstrate. 50,000 came to demonstrate against that law. 5 times as much. And the journalist comments that many of the people who were in the demonstrations were either themselves workers of these NGOs, or had a family member working for the NGO, or a good friend working for the NGO. So the peace camp in Israel has turned occupation into a source of income. They profit from the occupation. And I have to say that I also worked in an NGO I think that would be very, would certainly not call itself Zionist left, and was much more politically active against occupation. But I also have to acknowledge that in that capacity, I was also profiting from occupation. Right? And another interesting thing that the Zionists left profits from this debate about occupation is that it allows to create a kind of imaginary enlightened society in Israel, which is secular and Ashkenazi, while the pro-occupation argument is being blamed on the Mizrahi Jews, and so Jews from Arab descent, and on the religious Jews. It's because they're religious fanatics, they don't want peace, and that's the problem. This is, of course, very convenient for the Israeli government, because when Netanyahu goes to meet international leaders like Obama, and he says, well, you know, I would really want to have a Palestinian state, but these crazy religious people don't let me, then it's very easy for him to do it like that. But of course, the truth of the matter is that these groups are only allowed to have this influence because the real elites in Israel, which are still today mostly secular and Ashkenazi, these elites actually are the ones who continue the occupation. It's not the religious groups, and it's not the Mizrahi groups. The last group that I think is interesting to discuss, not the last, the one before last, sorry, is the lower socioeconomic classes in Israel, especially Mizrahi Jews, who are many of them live in poverty, many of them don't have jobs, and yet this group of people votes for right-wing parties and also openly and very clearly support the occupation. The Israeli Zionist left parties like to have advertisements or statements where they say, we need to send the money to the neighborhoods and not to the colonies. They say, we know how to make the economy better, and these people don't know, so they should support us, these people from the lower socioeconomic groups, and by supporting the occupation, they are actually harming themselves. I think this argument is extremely arrogant, and is an argument that does not try to understand why these people support the occupation. In fact, I've had many conversations myself with people who explain to me, we know that the left is better for the economy, or we know that occupation costs a lot of money, but we support it for other reasons. It's not just about the money. It's not done out of stupidity or blindness. It's done out of an understanding of the situation. The military service, for example, in Israel, is very closely tied to the occupation. Soldiers, if they are in the army, they will almost 100% going to do something to do with occupation in some way or another. And if they're going to have any kind of confrontation, if they are combat soldiers, if they're going to have any kind of combat experience, it's going to be with Palestinians, most likely. Small chance maybe with Lebanese, but that's less common. So for them to become heroes, for them to get to use the military as a way to get social status, they need an occupation. They need this conflict. And most importantly is what happens in the checkpoint itself. The checkpoints are staffed, usually the soldiers from the elite groups, soldiers from high-educated families, usually don't want to go to the checkpoints. That is very unpleasant work, to stand all day in the checkpoint with armor that weighs many kilograms. And soldiers from high-educated families will usually find a way to go to some kind of unit that will give them some kind of advantage, like maybe work in high-tech. But if they go to the checkpoint, that usually means that they are from lower socioeconomic classes, that they are not so well educated, probably do not have a high school certificate. This is a generalization, of course, there are always exceptions, but the thing is that the soldiers in the checkpoint, regardless of their education, regardless of what kind of job they're going to do after the military, if they will find a job, in the checkpoint, they are gods. They can decide the life and death of the people around them. Palestinians come to the end of the line, and they will decide, I'm going to talk to you today, or maybe not today. If I don't like your face, I will kick you out, or I will humiliate you. If If I like you, I will not even check you, I will not search you, and you can pass. This gives them a lot of power. They have, within the checkpoint, a mini reality in which all of the humiliation that they suffer in their normal life, because they went to a bad school, or because they live in a very poor town, or because their family is poor. In the checkpoint, that doesn't matter. Nobody can tell them what to do. And indeed, some of them find a way to stay in this occupation system. This is how colonialism works. Colonialism creates a class of bureaucrats, soldiers, jailers, people who maintain the occupation. That creates jobs. And indeed, like in every kind of colonialism that you see around the world, there is a class like that created in Israel as well. But mainly, I don't want to focus so much on that, because this makes also, again, this impression as if it's because of the money, but it's not really because of the money, it's because of the status. And for these people from the lower socioeconomic class, they are fully aware that they are converting money into status. They can never become middle class, they can never become rich, but as long as they identify themselves with the winners, which is, in this context, with the Israeli Jews, the dominant group in this area, they are the ruling class, and it doesn't matter how much money they have. And this, of course, explains why they don't have a lot of why the Communist Party in Israel does not have a lot of success creating joint work between Jewish and Palestinian workers, because the Jewish workers know that if they create solidarity with Palestinian workers, they're willingly joining the losing side. They're willingly joining the weak side of the equation. The last group is the arms industry. The arms industry is indeed a very interesting thing. I think I'll go rather quickly over that, because I want to leave some time for the questions. But I did mention, of course, the issue of the occupation working as a laboratory. This is a laboratory not for conventional weapons, because the last conventional war that Israel actually fought was in 1973. And since then, the Israeli soldiers have no experience fighting armies. They fight only civilians and maybe some guerrilla groups. But the technologies that they develop for these groups are becoming a very important Israeli export. Here we see the biggest weapons exporters in the world. The United States is the biggest weapons exporter in the world, more than everybody else. I think you can see that clearly. Germany is number 4, which is very high. To be honest, in different years, Germany can also be number 5 or 6. It depends how we count the years. And Israel is only number 7. So Israel is not the biggest arms exporter in the world. I hope that's clear. But I thought it would be interesting Israel is just one place under China. This is the line that we see here on the left, right? How many billions of dollars worth of weapons each of these countries exported, and this is based on information of the State Department in the United States. An average of the years 2008 to 2011. I decided to add also a line for the population of these countries in the middle, a column, and then to check what is the export per capita, per person. And I think that changes the picture somewhat. For example, China is removed from the equation, because even if China is quite a large weapons exporter in the world altogether, it only exports $6 per person. So weapons is not an important export for China. The United States still exports quite a lot. $467 per person per year. That's a lot. But it's no longer number 1. It's number 2. Number 1 is Israel, with $889 per person per year. Now, this should not give you the impression that all Israelis are arms dealers. This is, of course, not the case. Most Israelis do not work in the arms industry, but it does tell us something about how important is the arms industry to the Israeli economy. We actually showed, our group, we showed the movie The Lab by Tom Feldman here in the university, and I don't know if some of you have already seen it. I recommend it very much. It shows exactly how the occupation creates the experience and the knowledge that Israeli companies need in order to sell their weapons, and how retired officers can get another career working as arm dealers. But I do want to say that if we look at the economic significance of that to Israel, I said it's very important to Israel, but it's not the biggest export of Israel. More importantly, there are now, in the last years, recent signs that the Israeli arms industry is in crisis, in a real serious crisis. The highest year of weapons export from Israel was 2009. In the last 6 years, there is a decline. And one of the reasons for this decline is that despite of all this technology, the Palestinians are not giving up. That's a problem for the Israeli military. They have the ability to kill as many Palestinians as they want. Unfortunately, there is no shortage of bombs. But they did not develop the bomb that prevents people from resisting again after they lose family members and friends. They have all of these jails, but they did not develop a jail that is sophisticated enough that the person who is released from jail will then become a loyal subject of the occupation. So the customers of Israeli weapons start to understand that the Israeli technology does not really solve political problems and is no substitute for political process, and the interest in Israeli technology is declining. But I think it's worth to look at this graph very briefly. This is a graph that was produced by Shimshon Becher and Jonathan Nitzan, two economists, one Israeli, one Canadian, who've studied the Israeli economy very closely, but also its role within the global political economy. And this graph shows the profits of the global weapon and oil companies. It's a graph of global companies, not Israeli companies. And it doesn't really show the profit, it shows the relative profit of oil and weapon companies compared to all other sectors of the economy. So if the graph is high, that means weapon and oil companies made more profit than all the other kinds of companies, more than pharmaceutical, more than car companies or service companies and so on. If it's low, this is what they call a danger zone. The danger zone is a time where the peaceful industries, so all sectors except oil and weapons, are making more profit than the oil and weapon industries. And why do they call it a danger zone? Because if you look at the graph, you see that after almost every time there is a period of this kind of danger zone, so the oil and weapon companies go under the average, there is a little explosion. This explosion is a sign that there is an energy conflict in the Middle East. Energy conflicts are defined as a conflict between two countries in the Middle East where at least one of these countries is either a major oil producer or has major oil pipelines going through it. Israel is neither a major oil producer, nor does it have major oil pipelines going through it. It's neither of these two. And nevertheless, in most of these explosions, the other country in the Middle East was Israel. So Israel is a force of destabilization in the Middle East. And after every one of these explosions, you can see the graph goes high. That means that these wars in the Middle East affect the profits of companies, but these companies are not Israeli companies. They're international companies. You know that the United States is the biggest, gives Israel a military aid. Israel is the biggest recipient of military aid in the world. These are military weapons, so US weapons that are given free to the Israeli military. And Henry Kissinger, the former Secretary of State of the United States, once said, for every tank that we give to Israel for free, the neighbors of Israel buy 4 tanks from the United States. And I think that really gives us an image of what kind of role Israel plays geopolitically and who really profits from the occupation. And it's not the Israelis. Maybe you've heard this idea that IPAC is the the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee. It's the Israeli lobby in the United States. You've heard that they have a lot of influence. They control the White House. They control Congress. That's absolutely not true. It's a conspiracy theory. But we do see that the U.S. administration, Obama, likes to talk to IPAC and shows his support to IPAC. I think this is how we have to understand this. We have to look at who are the big lobby groups in the United States and how they work. And on this graph, I put IPAC is here. There's a small typo, sorry. Then on the left, there is J Street, which is another pro-Israeli lobby, which is more peaceful but still pro-Israeli and Zionist. And then I put the 4 biggest military US companies, which are arms companies. What is the size of their lobby? Just their lobby budget, not the size of the company, just the lobby budget. And compared it to the size of the budget of IPAC. When we have here Lockheed Martin, Boeing, General Electric, Northrop Grumman. I imagine most of you know these names. These are the companies that make the F-16s and the F-35 and the aircraft carriers and missiles and so on. Each one of these companies is at least 5 times bigger than IPAC. Each one of them. And the 4 of them together make IPAC seem very small indeed. But can you imagine that Obama will go to the lobby of Lockheed Martin, for example, and say to them openly, don't worry, the United States will make sure there will never be peace in the Middle East. I don't think he can do that openly. But if he goes to the IPAC lobby and says the United States will always support Israel, which he does, this is exactly what he says, then the message is understood clearly by Lockheed Martin, by Northrop Grumman, by General Electric. They understand if the United States is supporting the occupier, there will not be peace. If there's not peace, there's a good market for weapons. So the whole issue of Israel-Palestine is a very divisive political question, not just for Israel and Palestine. It's also a divisive political question here and around the world. Even if Palestine is quite small, it's a symbol. It's a symbol for the global left and the anti-imperialist, especially the anti-imperialist left and movements around the world who want to protest violation of human rights. And they look at the Palestinian struggle as an example that they can learn from. And we also see at the same time right-wing parties looking to Israel as a model to be imitated. You've heard that Marine Le Pen in France won a big victory in the elections because a lot of French people wanted a more right-wing, anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, anti-immigrant government. And Marine Le Pen is one of the biggest fans of Israel. She had a big fight with her father over this because her father is not a big fan of Israel. But she supports Israel a lot, and she tries to get pictures with the Israeli ambassador to the UN and to meet with the Israeli ambassador to France. Why is that? I don't think it's because she's a Zionist. She wants to be associated with Israel because Israel is the image of where is the technology, where is the political legitimacy to treat people differently just because of their religion, of the color of their skin, of their place where they were born. If you want a country that just openly has racist laws against these people, you have to look to Israel. And the Israeli government understands that this is also something that they can use to create political contacts and diplomatic contacts around the world and profit diplomatically from the occupation. So, I think this is a good place to stop. Thank you very much. And if you have any comments or questions.